Hi, Kristen Ashison again, and this is Chapter 1, Foundations, and this is Video 5, talking about psychophysics. So in psychophysics, we're looking at whether we can determine absolute threshold, if something's perceivable or not. So the term psychophysics is really interested in measuring behavior and specifically using behavior to determine perception. So absolute threshold is something perceivable or not. This marks the transition from the psychological state of not detecting the stimulus to the state of detecting it. It reveals which stimuli are more detectable, and it involves measurement that the present stimulants vary in intensity so that we can determine which one you've detected. So kind of think of it as if you have a faint sound playing in the other room, it could be something like your washing machine or your dishwasher. How far away from it do you have to get where you can hear it or not? So you can go into any of your rooms that have, any kind of sound that's going on. You could do a small tone on your phone, something like that, and have it going and steadily start to walk away from it until you can't hear it anymore. And it needs to be pretty faint to begin with. And then once you can't hear it anymore, walk closer until you can. That's going to be your absolute threshold when something's perceivable or not. And this isn't just for auditory. This can be for any mode of perception. So vision, you can have an absolute threshold for light. You can have an absolute threshold for taste. So how much salt do you have to put in a gallon of water? How much sugar do you have to put in a gallon of water before you can detect it, before it's perceivable or not? And there's different ways to measure this. The first one we're going to talk about is, your book talks about it as the quick and dirty method. It's the method of adjustment. And it's basically kind of what I was just talking about, where you're adjusting the tone or you're adjusting the stimulus directly. So in the case of something like volume, the participant would be adjusting the volume until they can't hear it, and when they can. So that absolute threshold, or when they can hear it versus when they can't. And the problem with this is it's not the same all the time. So you're not getting really, really reliable results with absolute threshold, but it gives you a kind of a window into it. It's a kind of a good starting place to look at it. The next one we're going to talk about is the method of constant stimuli. Now this has a launchpad example for it that I want you guys to go do, and it really kind of walks you through how this detection method works. So just like our previous method, it's a behavioral method as well, and their participants are given this fixed set of stimuli, and it covers a whole range, and they're repeated in random order. So if it's an auditory range, there'll be different tones, levels of tones given. If it's a visual range, maybe different tones of light or different tones of luminosity, something like that. And they have to indicate whether or not they have seen it or not. So kind of yes, no answer. So when you go through and you do the launch pad, you're going to be typing yes or no on your computer, and the example will tell you which keys to press for that. In a perfect world, your results would look like this, where you can detect something and then you can't. This would be a really clear-cut saying that, at an intensity of 3, a tone intensity of 3, that the participant can detect it. The problem is our results tend to look more like this. It's not always as clear-cut. We're kind of getting, it's kind of more gradual detection. Sometimes we notice it and sometimes we don't. This curve actually has a really fancy name, and it's a name that your book talks about as psychometric function. And this is that curve that relates to the measure of experience intensity to the physical stimulus. So where you're perceiving that physical stimulus. So this psychometric function is something that we'll talk about more when we start talking about the different laws and the different theories in the next video. So again, its fancy name, psychometric function. The other method that we're going to talk about in the Launchpad example that I want you to work through is still behavioral methods, and it's the staircase method. And they're given, and what happens here is you're given a stimulus and you have to indicate whether you detect it or not. So again, it's going to be the yes and no, but it's going to change the stimuli so that it kind of goes back and forth. And when you get to a reversal of yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, it will determine that that was your absolute threshold, okay? So it's going to do this reversal tone, and your results will look something like this. So again, do that, that Launchpad example. I purposely did not discuss those two very much because the Launchpad does a really great job of walking you through that. So please make sure you're doing that. The other thing that we talk about in terms of psychophysics is the just noticeable difference, or the difference threshold. Is this the same or is it different? And whereas absolute threshold is that sensitivity of the system. Can you hear it? Can you see it? Can you detect it? The difference threshold defines the minimum difference between two stimuli so that you can perceive that they're different. And you have different just notable differences, or JNDs, for different kinds of stimuli. One that I do with my intro students to kind of demonstrate this is about touch. So you can do this with a friend or a partner, and you take 2 toothpicks and you do either your finger and your forearm. So you take 2 toothpicks and you put them next to each other and you move them apart, and you have to determine when it starts to feel like 2 toothpicks versus when it feels like 1 press. You can do it the reverse and do them apart and versus when they go together. And then do the same thing on your forearm. And you'll notice that these are different. That's because your finger has more sensory neurons than your arm does. And so the sensation will be different even though you're doing the exact same thing. You can also do this on your cheeks versus close to your lips. You'll have the same kind of thing because, again, there's a difference in the number of sensory neurons there. But again, it's the minimum difference between 2 stimuli that you can perceive that those 2 things are different. So those 2 stimuli, the first one is usually called the standard stimulus, and it is just that. It's the one that we're comparing everything to. And the second one is called the comparison stimulus. So here's an example. In this image here, how many squares do you see? I personally see 2 squares in a larger rectangle, but there's actually 3 squares. There's a square in the middle there. The problem is the middle one isn't different enough for us to detect it. Okay, so how much would we have to adjust that middle square to make it noticeable? That would be the just noticeable difference. Whereas we can detect that first one is lighter and then that third one is darker. That one in the middle matches that background color enough, it's close enough to that comparison stimuli, or it's close enough to that original stimulus that we can't to tell it's different. Just like we measured absolute threshold, we'll measure just noticeable difference, and we can do this again with the method of adjustment, which is again where the person is controlling that, and the method of constant stimuli. The method of constant stimuli is the one that we typically use when we're talking about just noticeable difference, and we define just noticeable difference then as the constant is reporting 50% of the time. They're saying yes, that they're noticing it. So it's right there at that threshold. They're saying yes 50% of the time. They're saying no 50% of the time. It's right there on the dividing line between perceiving and not perceiving. So usually method of constant stimuli is the one we're using a lot of times when we talk about just noticeable difference, and that is again defined as 50% of the time. So that ends this video. I'll see you in the next one.